Hi, this is Jason Lisk with PoolGenius, here with your December Bracketology show. Now, back in early November, right before the start of the college basketball season, we did our preseason show where we projected out and predicted the 2026 NCAA Tournament. Now that we have a little over a month in the books, now that we've had these holiday tournaments, these big events, the ACC SEC Challenge last week, and so we've had a lot of big non-conference games. And also, the NCAA released its net rankings, its initial version of the net rankings last week. So now that we have all that, I thought it'd be a good idea to take stock of those initial predictions, talk about where I see things going forward now as we try to predict the 2026 NCAA tournament, and what it all means. And so we're going to dive in to the results and the projections. Now, a little bit about me and what we do here at PoolGenius. One, we have a PoolGenius Bracket Picks product along with other products like NCAA Tournament Survivor, NCAA Women's Bracket Picks, Calcutta tools, etc. when we get to the 2026 NCAA Tournament. And we love to track and follow college basketball in general and predict what's going to happen. So as I sit here, I'm working on teams, and we're going to predict the NCAA tournament on Selection Sunday. And then when you get to Selection Sunday, our bracket picks will be there to give you the best advice to win your bracket pools. Now, a little bit about me. I have been doing bracket predictions as long as I can remember. Used to jot them in my college notebook back before the internet was really a thing. Yes, I'm that old. And so this has been a lifelong hobby of mine. The bracket matrix tracks people to make bracket predictions. I am currently, I think after the last 5 years of results, ranked 31st out of over 180 sites and individuals that they track that has at least a 5-year history of data. And so it's really a passion of mine, but I do it a little different than a lot of others. Come Selection Sunday, obviously, my final predictions are going to be what the committee is going to do on that day. Right now, and going forward early in the season, what I'm doing is trying to predict Selection Sunday. And there is a difference. There are bracketologists that put teams, they react to specific results, put teams in or out. Maybe they react to the specific net rankings on an individual team. I am more focused on predicting what I think it will look like on Selection Sunday, which conferences are going to get bids based on how those teams have done overall, what teams' future schedules look like, what their opportunities are to get wins to impress the committee. And so that's what we're going to do in this show throughout the year. We're not just talking about what has happened. We're also talking about what it looks like, what the predictions are for Selection Sunday. So let's get to it. But first, as a final reminder, if you like this content, if you want to see more of it, hit that like and subscribe button. This is the only bracketology show I'm going to do in December. We do tend to take a break in college basketball as we get close to the holidays. The number of conference games really slows down, and we pick back up after New Year's. And so the plan is to do another show like this in early January once we've gotten through this entire non-conference December schedule, once we're into conference season. And then at some point in January and going forward, we'll do a weekly show where we're talking about the issues of that week, which teams made moves, what things are looking like, etc., etc. So if you want to see more of this content, make sure you like and subscribe to let us know that you're interested in seeing it going forward. Now, let's get to our December bracketology breakdown. So what I want to do to start out is let's talk about the net. You probably hear lots of references to the net, the NCAA's ranking tool. The net was released in early December, and I'm going to go through what that means and how it really impacts what we're going to look at going forward. Now, individual teams may change a lot in the net, right? But what I'm of interest in is kind of like where conferences and numbers of teams in conferences are coming out. early in December in the net rankings. And the reason that is, I want you to think of, you know, the NCAA tournament bids as kind of a big smorgasbord or a big dessert platter of pies, right? And November and December are largely, they're going to be a long ways away from the NCAA tournament, but they're very important in determining the relative outlook of each conference to each other, right? How much of the overall tournament pie do conferences grab up in November and December? Because the committee uses those results in November and December to cross compare conferences and determine kind of like which teams are playing in tougher conferences, who has tougher opponents. And so these games really matter, and it's getting late early. By the time we're in early December, by the time we're through all those tournament events, a lot of non-conference matchups, 75% of a lot of teams' non-conference slates are probably done at this point. And so it's starting to shape up how these conferences compare to each other, and how they compare by the tool the NCAA is going to use. Now, the NCAA uses the net and takes it, and then they do comparisons on what they call quad 1 and 2. We'll get into that here in a second. But I want to pull up for you what the top 10 in the net looks like as of December 7th results. So through the first week of December, here are your top 10 by the committee, by the net rankings that the committee will ultimately use. Now, we see that Michigan, with their big results back in November, including winning the Players Heritage Festival, is coming at number 1. Duke at number 2. I don't think that should be any surprise. Anybody that's followed college basketball. And then we see Iowa State made a big jump with their win over Purdue over the last weekend inside the top 4. And Gonzaga is also rounding out the 4. Vanderbilt at 5. Arizona at 6. Connecticut at 7. BYU at 8. And then we see 2 more Big Ten teams, Purdue and Michigan State, round out the top 10. Now, it's important to note that when you look at these top 10, there still could be plenty of movement on these teams, obviously. And it's not ultimately your net ranking that determines your seed. It's more, these are the tools that tell the committee how you did against the teams it thinks are good. And so wins over Michigan, Duke, Iowa State, Gonzaga are going to carry a lot of cachet based on these initial rankings releases and a lot of these other top 10 teams. And so you might see a team, be top 10 in the net, but 16 or a 4 seed, like a top 16 team. And that may be because they didn't have quite the number of big wins, but they still rank highly. So anyway, that's how to think about the net. The next thing I want to go into is applying this net ranking, though, the thing I'm interested in for bracketology purposes as we try to predict. Let's look at the conferences. Let's pull up a breakdown I did of the conferences. I said I would talk about the quads, and that'll be a good way to illustrate what information we're looking at here. So here are the conferences, and I've laid out some information here for you. I've laid out how many teams from each of these conferences are in the top 30 in the net rankings as of December 7th, ranked between 31 and 50, between 51 and 75, between 76 and 100, and between 101 to 135. And then in that far column, I put what our projected bids based on adding up all of the percentages of each team in the conference to make the tournament are for that conference in our bracketology page. That's something you can find in the link below in the description here. I'll put a link to our bracketology page, and you can see those individual team results. But let's talk about this conference breakdown. So I think it's pretty interesting. So obviously the big power conferences are going to dominate. You see that the Big Ten, SEC, ACC, and Big 12 collectively have 24 of the top 30 teams in the net. It shouldn't be a surprise. We've seen these big power conferences, mega conferences pop up, and they have dominated early in 2025-26 season. So why did I break it down the way I did? So the NCAA uses what they call the quad system. And really the only quads that matter for what I try to predict how the NCAA committee will act, and what they tend to look at are quad one, what they call quad one and quad two. A quad one win is defined differently based on where the game is played. A home game is different than a road game, which is different than a neutral game for both. So top 30 games, that first column, those are going to be quad one games no matter where the game's played. So a road game at a top 30 is just a tougher quad one game, but it's quad one. A home game against a top 30 is also a quad one, as is a neutral. So when you look at those numbers in that column, that tells you how many opportunities those conferences are going to get. Teams in those conferences are going to get quad one type games no matter where the game's played. 31 to 50 and then 51 to 75. I broke them down that way because for neutral sites, top 50 games are quad one. 51 to 100 are quad two. So all those games in 31 to 50, that tells you how many, roughly how many could be quad one based on neutral or a quad two based on playing at home. 51 to 75 adds in the road quad one games. So if you face the 75th team in the net on the road, that will count as a quad one result. If it's against a team at home, it will be a quad two result. And then finally, those last two columns, 76-100, that's a quad two game. If it's neutral site, add in that last column, those games are only quad two if they're played on the road at the opponent that ranks 101 to 135. So I laid this out. So it gives us like a snapshot of how these conferences look, because remember how I talked about, you could divide up the pie, but right now they're grabbing pies. They're grabbing the biggest pies they can get. So then when they get in conference play and they start playing each other, those pies get divided up. You can gain from your own conference opponents, but if your opponents don't rank well in the conference, you're not going to gain much. And we've seen that impact teams in the past. So which teams have the biggest pies right now? Which teams are likely to get the most teams? It's those power conferences. Now I want to highlight the ACC because the ACC actually has the most top 30 teams right now in the net, just narrowly over the Big 12, Big 10, and SEC. This is notable because in recent years, that hasn't been the case. The ACC has really had limited number of at-large bids given out, and some of its even top finishers have struggled to make it in the tournament because they didn't have enough conference teams ranking highly in the net. North Carolina last year had a really good record, but they lost all their games against the very top of their conference, beat everybody else, and so everybody talked about that. They didn't have quad one wins. That's why that was. The middle of that conference was down. Well, in 2025 and 26, the ACC looks to be back. When you look at these numbers, you would say it's very likely, and we are projecting 8.0 bids for the ACC. And it makes sense. There's 7 teams in the top 30. There's another one in the top 50 and 4 more lurking just outside it right now in the top 75. That's a lot more quad one and quad two games for ACC teams this year than in the recent past. How is that planned out? Well, the ACC got only 4 bids last year, with people complaining about Carolina getting in as one of the last teams as that 4th team. Each of the 3 tournaments before that, 2004, 2003, and 2022, the conference got only 5. You have to go back to 2021 where it got more than 5, and that was 7. The last time the ACC has gotten at least 8 bids in the NCAA tournament was in the 2018 NCAA tournament. So we're projecting that the ACC is going to have its best year in terms of number of teams getting in the tournament that we've seen in a bit of a while. And so that's notable. Who goes down? Probably the Big East. If you look at their numbers, we know UConn's good, and they're in the top 10. St. John's is the only other top 30 team, and there's only 3 in the top 50, 31 to 50 range, and then 0 more inside the top 75. That all portends a little bit of doom for the Big East. As you can see, we're projecting 4 teams from that conference. The Big East better get some quality wins over the next few weeks, or the outlook for the middle of the pack Big East is going to be very much like it's been recently for the ACC. And then once we get outside those power conference teams, who could surprise? We've seen in recent years, the Mountain West has probably gotten the most bids from this next group of teams, the conferences that tend to get some at-large bids, but aren't considered power conference teams. That's the West Coast Conference with Gonzaga, the Mountain West, the Atlantic 10, and the American, with probably Memphis as the most notable team. Well, in 2025 and 26, it's actually the Atlantic 10 that looks like they could surprise. Interestingly, St. Louis has now climbed inside the top 30, but they have 2 other teams in the top 50, 2 more in the top 75, and then 4 more lurking inside the top 135. Add all that up, that's 9 teams in the Atlantic 10 this year showing up as potential quad 1 or quad 2 results, depending on where the game's played. That means teams like SLU, VCU, Dayton, George Washington are going to get plenty of opportunities to get those quad 2 results that do make a difference in making the NCAA tournament. So if you're going to ask me which conference might surprise on Selection Sunday in the number of bids and be like the Mountain West from a couple years ago, I actually don't think it's the Mountain West. I think it's the A10. The Mountain West has 7 such teams, but only 2 inside the top 50 and no more lurking in that 101 to 135 range. So I actually think the A10 is going to give teams slightly more opportunities there. The West Coast Conference, is, as usual, is a little bit top-heavy. Gonzaga and St. Mary's are in the top 30, and then Santa Clara is the only other team in the top 75. So you're probably looking at, again, those 2 plus maybe Santa Clara making a run. So that's the breakdown. That chart shows you every conference that has at least 1 team in the top 30 or 3 teams in the top 135. And you can see why we start projecting teams, conferences, not to have more than their auto bid. Because unfortunately for teams like Yale, who is in the top 30, or Akron, who is in the top 50 in the MAC, they don't have many opportunities to gain those quad 1 and quad 2 wins when they get into conference play. So they're going to have to be pretty much perfect to even get in the discussion for a bid. So now that we've gone through kind of how to think about what the conferences may shape up like and what the number of bids for each conferences is looking like coming out of the non-conference set of games, let's talk about where I have teams right now at the top of the 2026 NCAA tournament bracket. Here's my top 5 seeds for each region. Michigan and Duke are the 2 top projected 1 seeds. That shouldn't be a surprise. They were the top 2 in the net. They're joined by Iowa State and Arizona right now, though I would say that Arizona one is very in flux. Iowa State's big win over Purdue bumped them up there, and Arizona's right there with several others at the 1 seed line. Purdue, Vanderbilt, Connecticut, and Gonzaga are on the 2 line. Houston, who we had as a 1 seed in the preseason, right now has dropped to the 3, but they could certainly improve that. BYU on the 3 line from the Big 12 as well, and then Michigan State out of the Big 10 and Louisville. Down the 4 seed line, 2 SEC teams come in. Alabama, honestly, was very much in the range of being a 3 seed. Somebody had to bump down, but Florida, Alabama from the SEC, Kansas from the Big 12, and Illinois from the Big 10. And finally, to round it out, Virginia and North Carolina from the ACC as 5 seeds, Georgia from the SEC as a 5 seed, and St. John's last year, a team that got a 2 seed out of the Big East, has played a tough schedule, but has taken some losses. We have them projected for the 5 seed line. So that's our top of bracket projection now as we sit here in December. Now, I will say a little bracketology geek talk, but something the committee needs to be aware of. This is going to be a very hard year to bracket these teams. There are lots of reasons for that. Some of them are just the way things are now. With these mega conferences with 16 teams, 18 teams, and potentially 8, 9, 10 bids, it's really hard to follow bracketing principles throughout the bracket. Because one of the standard bracketing principles when you're creating a bracket is you try to balance the regions by making sure the top 4 teams, if they're on the top 4 seed lines, are spread across the regions. But that's going to be really hard to do this year unless you're going to violate other principles, because something else the committee likes to do is put teams in their geographic region for either the regional sites or the first and second round sites. Well, I'll give you an example of how BYU in the mix, a team from the Big 12 and a team from the West, can really impact this. BYU can only play on Thursday, Saturday, right? So that limits the options of where they can go. For the regionals, that means they've got to go to the West or South, which are the 2 regions that are going to play Thursday, Saturday. Well, if Arizona's the 1 seed in the West, that's another Big 12 team going there. If Iowa State's a 1 seed, they're probably going to the South, just because Michigan's going to take Chicago and Duke's going to take the East region in Washington, D.C. Well, if that happens, you're probably going to be putting BYU with a fellow Big 12 team among the top 3 seed lines. It's just how it's going to happen. And because of all these other conflicts, you may have to move teams out of their geographic region. I think Gonzaga is probably naturally targeted for the West, but I moved them here because it was such a headache to come up with regions that were balanced and had the right mix of Big 12, Big 10, SEC teams balanced across the regions. And so teams like Gonzaga and Connecticut are a little bit at the mercy of balancing all these other conferences that are eating up so many bids. But anyway, that's the top of the bids for our projections in December. We have seen some movement at the top, but most of those teams were among our top 4 to 5 seed lines in our preseason bracketology. But let's now switch and talk about the biggest movers as we close out this show. Who are the biggest movers over the first month of the college basketball season? Which teams have either disappointed or made a big leap, and in such a way that it really impacts how we would project the bracket? Well, here are your biggest risers and fallers from our preseason bracketology. The biggest riser, Vanderbilt, out of the SEC. We've got them on the 2 line. They certainly could be in the discussion, and it wouldn't be a surprise if they moved all the way to the 1 seed line based on how they played so far this season. So Vanderbilt is probably your biggest pleasant surprise. The opposite, because we had Vanderbilt projected as a 7 seed, and now having this 2. Well, the team that went the other way is also from the SEC, Kentucky. One of the bigger disappointments, expected to be a top 10 team in the preseason, has certainly not looked it so far, has been inconsistent. We've got them down, still in the field, but down as a 7 seed. A third SEC team is another surprise, Georgia. We had them in, but closer to the bubble in our original bracketology predictions back in early November. Now we have them on the 5 line. We have them as an emerging team that could be a threat for one of those top 5 seed lines. UCLA out of the Big 10 is our other faller that's still in the field, but was inside our top 4 seed lines back in November. We've got them now projected as a 10. Overall, there are 8 different teams who were projected in as an at-large in our initial release and are no longer in our projections today, which means there are 8 that have moved in. The biggest fallers, the teams, we haven't had any top 6 seed line teams that we are no longer projecting in the tournament. I think that's a testament, and last year it was the same thing. We had, I believe, 1 team inside the top 6 seed lines that ultimately did not make it, 1 or 2 from our preseason predictions. So the 7 seed line in our preseason prediction hasn't been working out. Oregon has disappointed, gotten off to a rough start. Center Nate Biddle had some injuries. This team is struggling, as is Mississippi State out of the SEC. And then Missouri, who just lost to Kansas, has not played a tough schedule in the non-conference until December. And they've now lost at Notre Dame and lost by 20 to Kansas, falling in our predictive ratings. And when you add in their non-conference strength of schedule and now their projection in the SEC falling, they've now fallen on the wrong side of the bubble as well. Who's moved in? The biggest surprises are the conference I talked about, the ACC, a conference we're projecting now to take a big leap forward in the number of bids it's getting compared to recent years. Virginia, Clemson, and SMU are the biggest beneficiaries of that. We had those teams just on the outside of the bubble, but now we've got them solidly in as 6, 7, and 8 seeds based on how the conference as a whole has performed. So that's your wrap on the December 2025 show for the 2026 NCAA Tournament projections. You can check out our daily updates on bracketology projections, which update regularly with each night's results on our bracketology page. The link will be down below. And then we'll be back in January with another bracketology breakdown.